Hello everyone and welcome to the lecture on reading and writing files. In this lecture we'll see how we can read a given file and we'll also see how to write in a file. For this lecture I have created two files, file 1 and file 2, and I have saved them where my Jupyter homepage is located. So file 1, I have added 5 lines, and then file 2 has a single line, and I have saved them both where my home book is located in the same directory. Let's start by looking at reading files. In order to read a file, we need to open it first, and for that we'll be using Python's built-in function known as open. This function allows us to open a given file. So let's do that. Open, and let's open our first file, which is open, and then pass your file name, which is file1.txt. So this will open our file. So if we run this, we don't get anything, right? It says open file, file text. And what we'll do next is save this in a variable. Let's say first file. And now we'll take our first file object, which contains the file that's opened, and then we'll use another method known as read, and this method allows us to read a file. So once we have the file open, we'll use the read function to read the file. So we have our file object first file that read. Now if we run it, we have the content of our file as a string. So it says this is the first line, and then new line, this is the second line, new line, this is the third line, and then we have a new line, and then this is the last line. So we are able to read the entire file as a string. Okay, so first we opened our file with the function by using the function open, and then we applied the read function to read the contents of a given file. And if we try to read our file again, the result will be an empty string. We get an empty string. This is because once we read the file, our cursor is at the end of our file, so there is nothing more to read, and we get an empty string. So if we want to read the file again, we'll have to reset the position of our cursor to the beginning of the file. And there is a method that we can use to reposition the position of the cursor, and that method is called the seek method. So we have our file, first file, our file object, and then we'll call the seek method on it. So this will reposition the cursor to the beginning or wherever you want it. So this seek method can take values 0, 1, and 2. So values could be 0, 1, or 2. So 0 is an absolute position. It means it will take the cursor to the beginning of your file. So it's an absolute reference point. Whereas if you apply 1, it means your reference point is your current file position. And then 2 means your reference point is your end of the file. So for our example, we will use 0. That means it will move the cursor to the beginning of the file. So first file.seek, and now if we try to read our file again, we'll get the entire file. Run it again, we get the file contents, And then we can use the seek position. We can use the seek function to reposition our cursor. So 0 means to the beginning. Your reference point is the beginning of your file, whereas 1 is your current file position, and 2 means your reference point is the end of your file. Okay, now that we have seen the read function, there's also another function known as the read line function. Okay, before we see the read line function, let's reposition our cursor to the beginning of our file. And let's look at the read line function. So we have our first file object, and then we'll call the read line method on it. So if we run this, we get this is the first line. Then we have a new line. So the read line method reads one line at a time. So first file, that read line, that's your first line. And then if we call the read line method again, we'll get the second line, since the cursor is at the second line. Now if we call the read line method again, we get this is the third line. And if we call the seek method, this will reposition the cursor to the beginning of our file. And if we call the read line method again, we'll get this is the first line, which is now it's at the beginning. So the first sentence will be read, which is this is the first line. So if we run this again, we get this is the first line. If we run this again, we get this is the second line. If we paste it again, this is the third line. Command V, this is the fourth line. If we use the read line again, we get this is the last line. Now that we are at the end of the cursor, at the end of the file, if we call the read line function, we'll get an empty string because we are at the end of the file. And if we want to read again, we'll have to call the seek method to move the cursor to the beginning of the file. Right? Great. There's also another function known as the read lines function. Okay, let's look at that. We have our first file, and then let's reposition our cursor to the beginning of our file. Now let's look at the read lines method. So the one we just looked at is the read line method. Now we're looking at read lines. So the difference is when you use the read lines method, it gives you the entire file. It gives you the entire file as a list. So if we look at the read lines method and run it, we get the entire file as a list, right? We have each line as a string, and then the entire file is enclosed in a list. That's the read lines method. And if we call the read lines method again, you'll get an empty list because our cursor is at the end of our file. And again, we can reset our file. We can reset our cursor by calling the seek method. So first file dot seek, and then pass 0. Great. So just to summarize, we saw how we could read a file by using the read method, read line method, and the read lines method. And we saw that we have to open our file first before we could read our file. And we also saw that we can use the seek method or function to reposition our cursor to the beginning of the line, to the beginning of our file, by passing 0 as an attribute. In the next lecture, we'll continue our discussion of reading and writing files. Thank you, everyone.